You can leave the gifts by the hallway, Richard, my daughter-in-law whispered to me before I even took my coat off. We're trying to keep the dining room for immediate family. I honestly thought I misheard her at first. Snow was still melting off my boots onto the hardwood floor while my 12-year-old granddaughter Emma ran toward me yelling, "Grandpa's here." But Melissa stepped in front of her so smoothly, it almost looked practiced. Then she leaned closer to me with that tight smile she always used when other people were watching and quietly said, "You weren't actually invited tonight. Daniel just didn't know how to tell you." I stared at her for a second while everyone else laughed around the Christmas table 20 feet away like nothing had happened. The smell of rosemary turkey and cinnamon candles filled the house I helped pay for, and somehow I felt less welcome than a delivery driver standing in the cold. "Paying bills doesn't make you family," she added under her breath. I remember holding that bottle of Cabernet so tightly my fingers hurt. Then I took a sip from the glass in my hand, looked her dead in the eye, and calmly said, "Then I hope you can cover the $9,000 due tomorrow." The color drained out of her face so fast it scared me a little. If stories like this truly resonate with you, maybe take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to your heart. And I'd really love to know where you're watching from tonight. Leave your city, your country, and your local time down below. Sometimes it helps knowing somebody out there understands what loneliness feels like during the holidays. My name is Richard Bennett. I'm 72 years old, and this was the Christmas dinner that finally broke apart the illusion my family had been living inside for years. But to understand why my daughter-in-law looked like she'd seen a ghost after I mentioned that money, I need to take you back about 6 months before that night. Back to the first moment I realized something in my family had quietly started changing. My son Daniel used to call me every Sunday morning. Didn't matter if it was 5 minutes or 50. He'd call while making pancakes for Emma and ask me dumb questions he already knew the answer to. "Dad, how long do you bake salmon again? Or you still got that snowblower?" Small things. Normal things. Then the calls started slowing down. At first I blamed work. Daniel managed a regional furniture warehouse outside Hartford, and business had gotten rough after layoffs started hitting Connecticut. Then the excuses got stranger. Melissa already made plans. "We're busy this weekend. Maybe next week, Dad." I try not to take it personally. When you get older, you learn how to swallow disappointment quietly. People don't really talk about that part of aging. They talk about retirement and fishing and grandkids. Nobody tells you how invisible you start becoming in your own family. Around September, Daniel asked if I could temporarily help with a few expenses, just until things stabilized. I didn't hesitate. I wired money for Emma's private school tuition, paid off a heating repair before winter, covered part of their property taxes after Daniel admitted they'd fallen behind. He looked embarrassed the night he told me. We were sitting in my truck outside a diner off Route 44 while rain hit the windshield. "I hate asking, Dad," he muttered. "You know I do. You're my son," I told him. "That's what family's for." He actually looked like he might cry for a second. But Melissa never thanked me. Not once. She treated every check like it had appeared magically out of thin air. Like bills simply handled themselves. The strange thing was, the more I helped them, the colder she became toward me. She stopped asking me to stay for coffee after I dropped things off. Stopped including me in family photos online. One afternoon in October, I brought Emma a bicycle for her birthday, a light blue Schwinn with silver handlebars she'd been begging for, and Melissa laughed while unloading it from my truck. "Richard," she said, "you really don't have to buy affection." I remember Emma's little face dropping when she heard that. "Mom," she whispered, embarrassed. But Melissa just smiled and carried the cake inside like she hadn't done anything wrong. That was the first moment something cold settled into my stomach. A week later, I accidentally found out why. And the worst part wasn't what Melissa said behind my back. It was who was sitting there agreeing with her. The thing about Daniel is that he was never the kind of kid who asked for much. Even when he was little, he hated feeling like a burden. When his mother died 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer, something inside him changed permanently. He stopped arguing, stopped pushing back. He became the kind of man who apologized before speaking. I noticed it slowly at first. Melissa would correct him in front of people, and he would just smile awkwardly like it was easier than defending himself. One Thanksgiving, maybe 3 years before all this, Daniel dropped a serving spoon on the kitchen floor, and Melissa sighed loud enough for everyone to hear. "That is why I do everything myself," she muttered while grabbing paper towels. Everybody laughed nervously except Emma, who looked uncomfortable even back then. Daniel bent down to clean the gravy himself and quietly said, "Sorry, babe." I remember standing there thinking how strange it sounded for a grown man to apologize for gravity. Their house had always felt tense in small ways. Not screaming, not obvious, just little moments that added up over time like cracks spreading through glass. Melissa cared deeply about appearances. The right neighborhood, the right school district, matching Christmas pajamas for photos online, expensive kitchen appliances they could not actually afford. One afternoon, she spent nearly 40 minutes rearranging decorative pumpkins before guests came over while Daniel sat at the dining table, trying to figure out which credit card bill to pay first. "We cannot keep doing this," he whispered to her while she adjusted candles. "People notice things," she snapped back. "Do you want everyone thinking we are struggling?" I was standing in the hallway holding a bag of groceries pretending I had not heard them. That became my role over the years. Quietly pretending, quietly helping, quietly paying. Emma once asked me why her parents whispered so much at night. She was about 10 then. We were fishing at a small lake outside Bristol while eating peanut butter crackers. "They whisper after they think I am asleep," she told me. "Mom gets mad about money a lot." I remember looking out at the water for a second before answering carefully. "Adults get stressed sometimes, sweetheart." She kicked her sneakers against the dock. "Dad looks sad all the time now." That one hurt because she was right. Around that same time, Melissa started making comments that sounded harmless unless you paid attention. "Richard still does not understand modern finances. Richard worries too much. Richard thinks money fixes everything." She always said it with a little laugh afterwards so nobody could call her rude. But the comments kept coming. One night after Emma's piano recital, we all went to a steakhouse in Farmington. Daniel got up to take a work call, and Melissa leaned across the table while stirring ice in her water glass. "You know," she said casually, "sometimes helping too much keeps people dependent." I honestly thought she was talking about Emma at first. Then she looked directly at me. "Daniel needs confidence, Richard, not handouts." I just nodded slowly. I never wanted him struggling alone. She smiled at me, but it never reached her eyes. No parent does. A few weeks later, I stopped by their house unannounced because Daniel had not answered my calls for almost 8 days. His truck was in the driveway, but when I knocked, Melissa opened the door only halfway. "Oh," she said flatly. We were just about to head out. I could hear football on the television behind her. I could also hear Daniel laughing. "I just came to drop off the furnace payment receipt," I told her. The heating company needed confirmation. She took the envelope from my hand without inviting me inside. "You really should let us handle our own household expenses eventually," she said quietly. Then she closed the door before I could answer. I stood on that porch for maybe 10 seconds staring at my own reflection in the glass storm door like an idiot. And that was the night I finally did something I had never done before in my entire life as a father. I checked the account statements Daniel thought I had stopped monitoring. Years ago, what I found there made my stomach turn colder than the December air outside. The account was still technically connected to me because years earlier Daniel and I had opened it together when he started his first contracting business. I had not looked at it in a long time. Honestly, I trusted him. Maybe too much. I sat at my kitchen table that night with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me while snow tapped softly against the windows. At first, nothing looked unusual. Mortgage payments, utility bills, school tuition, grocery charges. Then I noticed the balances. They were lower than they should have been. Much lower. I kept scrolling. There were 3 maxed-out credit cards I had never heard about. A luxury furniture payment plan. 2 separate holiday shopping loans. A designer boutique in Greenwich that had charged almost $2,300 in one afternoon. My chest tightened. Then I saw the withdrawals from the reserve account I had quietly built for Emma's future college tuition. $30,000 gone over 8 months. I actually checked twice because I thought I was reading it wrong. The next morning I drove straight to Daniel's warehouse office. He looked exhausted when he came out to meet me in the parking lot. Dark circles under his eyes. Wrinkled dress shirt. He climbed into my truck and immediately knew something was wrong. "Dad?" he asked quietly. I handed him printed statements without saying a word. I watched his face slowly fall apart while flipping through the pages. "I can explain," he whispered. "Then explain." That was the first time in years I did not soften my voice for him. He stared down at the paperwork for a long moment before rubbing both hands over his face. "Melissa thought things would stabilize by summer," he finally admitted. Then interest rates went up. Then Emma's school raised tuition. Then, Daniel. He stopped talking. Did you take money from Emma's account? He looked out the windshield instead of at me. That answer hurt worse than words. I was going to replace it, he said softly. I swear I was. I leaned back against the seat and honestly felt older in that moment than I ever had before. How bad is it? I asked. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Bad enough that I barely sleep anymore. Then he said something I will never forget. Sometimes I feel like I am drowning in my own house. We sat there silently while trucks backed into loading docks nearby. Finally, I asked the question I had been avoiding for months. Does Melissa know how serious this is? Daniel hesitated too long. Not exactly. I almost laughed from disbelief. Your wife is buying $700 handbags while you are borrowing from your daughter's future? Please keep your voice down, he muttered automatically. And there it was again. Fear. Constant quiet fear. I drove home angry that day. Not explosive angry. Worse. Tired angry. The kind that settles into your bones. But something shifted inside me during that conversation. For the first time, I stopped seeing Daniel as a helpless kid I needed to rescue every time life got hard. He was 41 years old. A father. A husband. And somehow I had spent years helping them maintain a lifestyle none of them could actually afford while convincing myself it was love. 3 days later, I got an unexpected phone call that changed everything even more. An old business partner named Frank DeLuca wanted to buy out my remaining share in our commercial HVAC company. Richard, I am retiring to Arizona, he told me over the phone. I want this settled before January. I had almost forgotten those shares still existed. They had been sitting untouched for years, bringing in passive quarterly income one rarely even thought about. We met for lunch at a little Italian place in Hartford the following Friday. Frank slid the paperwork across the table while grinning. You are going to hate me for waiting this long, he joked. What are you talking about? He tapped the number on the last page. I stared at it for several seconds before realizing it was real. The buyout would leave me with a little over $1.4 million after taxes. Frank laughed when he saw my expression. Merry Christmas, Richie. But the strange thing was, the first emotion I felt was not excitement. It was dread. Because deep down, I already knew exactly what would happen if Melissa found out. For about 2 weeks, I told nobody about the buyout money except my attorney and my accountant. Not even Daniel. I needed time to think clearly for once. Every morning, I would sit in the same recliner near my living room window with coffee in my hand, while the old radiator clicked softly beside me. Snow kept falling across Fairview in slow gray waves, and for the first time in years I started asking myself a question that made me uncomfortable. What exactly had all my help accomplished? Daniel was still terrified all the time. Emma still walked on eggshells inside her own house. And Melissa kept spending money like appearances mattered more than peace. I should have trusted my instincts then. Instead, I made the mistake fathers always make. I thought maybe one honest conversation could still fix things. I invited Daniel to breakfast at a diner off Interstate 84. He looked exhausted again when he arrived. You okay? I asked him after he slid into the booth. Just tired. The waitress poured coffee while Christmas music played softly overhead. Finally, I leaned forward and lowered my voice. Frank bought my company shares. Daniel blinked. Wait. Seriously? I nodded once. It is a substantial amount. He stared at me in complete shock. Dad, that is amazing. Then almost immediately his shoulders tightened with anxiety. Melissa cannot know yet. That response told me everything. Why? I asked quietly. He rubbed his forehead. Because she is already making plans we cannot afford. I watched him carefully. What kind of plans? He hesitated before answering. A bigger house. Private high school in Boston later. Vacations. She keeps saying we are one breakthrough away from finally living the way we deserve. The word deserve sat badly with me for some reason. Daniel looked embarrassed, even saying it out loud. I have not told her about the money, I said firmly. And I need you to respect that. Of course, he answered immediately. But the problem with desperate people is that secrets become heavy very fast. 3 days later, I stopped by their house to drop off Emma's Christmas gift early because she would be with friends the following weekend. The second Melissa opened the front door, I knew. Her entire energy had changed. Suddenly, she was warm again, smiling, inviting me inside without hesitation. Richard, you should stay for dinner, she said brightly. Daniel will be home soon. I felt something sink in my stomach. Emma ran downstairs in fuzzy socks and hugged me around the waist while Melissa hovered nearby watching us carefully. Then she casually asked, "So how are things with the business sale?" I looked at her slowly. "Daniel talks too much." She laughed like I had made a joke. "Well, we are family." That word sounded very different coming from her now. Over the next week, things became stranger. Melissa started calling me constantly, asking if I needed help around the house, offering to bring over homemade soup, sending links to vacation rentals in Vermont saying things like, "Would not this be wonderful for all of us?" Then came the real conversations. One night after dinner, she sat across from me at their kitchen island while Daniel loaded the dishwasher silently behind us. "You know," she said while sipping wine, "families should build generational wealth together." I did not answer. She continued anyway. "Most parents want to see their children truly succeed before they die." Daniel froze for half a second at the sink. "Melissa," he muttered quietly, but she kept smiling at me. "I just think it would be beautiful if we finally had stability." I remember looking over at Emma coloring reindeer on the floor nearby, while Christmas lights reflected softly across the windows. Then I asked the question directly. "How much do you think stability costs?" Melissa laughed lightly. "More than Connecticut gives middle-class families these days." After that night, the pressure became constant. Mortgage conversations, investment suggestions, new home listings left open on Daniel's laptop whenever I visited. It stopped feeling accidental. Then one Sunday afternoon, I arrived early to Emma's choir performance at church and accidentally overheard Melissa talking to her sister in the hallway outside the fellowship room. "Once Richard finally helps us properly," she whispered, "everything changes." Her sister laughed softly. "You hit the jackpot with that father-in-law." Melissa answered so fast it sounded rehearsed. "Please. He owes Daniel after everything his father put him through growing up." I stopped walking. My entire body went cold. Because none of that was true. Not one word of it. And the worst part was hearing someone else nearby quietly agree with her. The person agreeing with Melissa in that church hallway was my own younger sister, Carol. I had not even seen her standing there at first, because she was half hidden behind the coffee station, holding one of those little styrofoam cups churches always use. Carol looked uncomfortable the second she noticed me. Melissa did not. That was the part one remember most clearly. She barely reacted at all. "Richard," she said smoothly, like we had just bumped into each other accidentally. Carol immediately started rambling. "We were not talking about you like that," she insisted too quickly. "You misunderstood." But Melissa just folded her arms calmly. "We are only worried about Daniel and Emma's future." I looked at both of them for a second and honestly felt tired more than angry. "By spending money that is not yours yet?" I asked quietly. Carol sighed dramatically like I was the difficult one. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Act like helping people makes you some kind of martyr." That word hit me hard because suddenly I realized something ugly had been spreading behind my back for a long time. Not just assumptions. A whole narrative. Somehow I had become the controlling old man who used money to manipulate his family instead of the person quietly keeping them afloat. Melissa stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Nobody is saying you have not helped. That is exactly what you were saying." For the first time, her smile disappeared completely. "Daniel spent his entire life trying to earn your approval." I actually stared at her in disbelief. "Approval?" I repeated softly. "I paid his mortgage 3 times this year." Carol jumped in immediately. "Money is not emotional support, Richard." I looked between them and suddenly understood why Daniel had become so anxious all the time. He had been living between 2 completely different versions of reality. That night, I drove home in silence with the church choir music still echoing in my head. I kept thinking about something Melissa said. Entire life. Like she had rewritten decades of memories into some story where I was the villain. Over the next several days, things only got worse. Carol stopped answering my calls entirely. Then my cousin Diane sent me a strange text message asking if I was doing okay emotionally. That wording unsettled me immediately. When I asked what she meant, she hesitated before finally admitting Melissa had told several relatives I was becoming controlling after receiving unexpected money. I sat there staring at my phone in complete disbelief. Apparently, I had been pressuring Daniel with finances. Apparently, I made Melissa uncomfortable. Apparently, they were trying to establish boundaries. Boundaries. That word suddenly appeared everywhere. I checked my voicemail one evening and found a message from Carol saying, "You cannot buy your way into people's lives forever. Richard. I listened to it twice because I honestly could not believe she had said it. Then came the emails. Melissa sent one titled Family Expectations. I wish I were joking. It was 3 full paragraphs about respecting Daniel and Melissa as the heads of their household and avoiding financial leverage during emotional disagreements. She actually used those exact words. At the bottom she wrote, "We want Emma growing up around healthy dynamics." Healthy dynamics. After draining her college fund behind closed doors, I started typing a response 3 separate times and deleted every version. Finally, I wrote one sentence. "I never wanted control. I only wanted my family safe." She never replied. A few days later, I mailed Emma a small Christmas ornament she had pointed out at a store weeks earlier. A hand-painted little ice skate with silver glitter. 2 days after that, the package came back unopened with "Return to Sender" stamped across the box in red ink. That one broke something inside me a little. I called Daniel immediately. He sounded panicked the second he answered. "Dad, please do not make this worse right now." "Worse?" I asked quietly. "Your daughter thinks I forgot about Christmas. Melissa is trying to create space." I laughed once before I could stop myself. Not because anything was funny, because I genuinely could not believe what I was hearing anymore. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked him. He lowered his voice instantly. "I cannot talk right now." Then he hung up on me. I sat alone at my kitchen table that night listening to the refrigerator hum in the dark while snow piled against the windows outside. My phone stayed completely silent for almost 48 hours after that. No calls, no texts, nothing. And somewhere deep down, I started realizing they were preparing to cut me out long before Christmas dinner ever arrived. By the second week of December, my house had become so quiet that I started leaving the television on just to hear another human voice. Not because I was watching it, just because silence can get heavy when you are older, especially during Christmas. Every year since my wife Linda died, I had still spent the holidays with Daniel and Emma. Linda loved Christmas more than anybody I ever knew. She used to start decorating before Thanksgiving while old Frank Sinatra records played through the house. She would stand on a chair hanging lights across the kitchen doorway while telling me I was being dramatic if I complained about untangling cords. "Richard Bennett," she would laugh, "one day you are going to miss all this noise." Turns out she was right. I missed all of it. The noise. The mess. Even the burned sugar cookies Emma used to make when she was little. Around that time, I started finding old signs that my family had already begun erasing me before I even realized it. My birthday dinner from the previous spring suddenly made more sense. Melissa had spent the entire evening talking about another family from Emma's school whose grandparents bought them a beach house in Rhode Island. "Some people understand legacy," she had said casually while cutting salmon. At the time, I thought it was just another comment. Now I understood it was pressure. Everything had been pressure for years. The gifts, the guilt, the emotional rewriting. One snowy afternoon, I drove to the cemetery to visit Linda. I had not gone in several weeks because the roads had been bad, but something inside me needed to sit with her for a while. I brushed snow off the headstone with my glove and stood there in the freezing wind, feeling ridiculous for talking out loud to someone gone 6 years. "I think I failed him," I admitted quietly. "I helped too much." My voice cracked a little after that. Or maybe not enough in the right ways. There was nobody around except a groundskeeper plowing snow near the back entrance. I stood there for almost an hour remembering little things. Daniel learning to ride a bike in our old driveway. Emma asleep on my chest during her first Christmas Eve. Linda squeezing my hand in the hospital during her final week telling me, "Take care of our family when I am gone." I had tried. God knows I had tried. But somewhere along the line, taking care of them had slowly turned into disappearing for them. That realization hurt more than the insults ever did. A few nights later, Emma secretly called me from her tablet after 9 o'clock. I almost cried hearing her voice. "Grandpa," she whispered. "Hey, sweetheart. Mom says we are keeping Christmas small this year." I closed my eyes for a second. I heard. She hesitated. "Did you and Mom have a fight?" "No, honey." "Then why is everybody acting weird?" Children always notice more than adults think they do. I tried to answer carefully. Sometimes grown-ups get confused about what matters. She got quiet for a moment before asking the question that nearly broke me. "Did you stop loving us?" I felt my throat tighten instantly. "Emma, no. Never. Because Mom says you are upset about money." There it was again. That same story spreading everywhere. I sat there staring at the dark kitchen window while snow drifted outside under the porch light. Finally, I said softly, "Money is not why I am hurt." She whispered, "I miss you." Then I heard footsteps somewhere near her, and she panicked. "I have to go." The call disconnected immediately after that. I sat there holding the silent phone for a long time. But strangely enough, something changed inside me. After that conversation, not anger, clarity. For months I had kept trying to defend myself to people who had already decided who I was. I kept begging for understanding instead of paying attention to what their actions were actually saying. And for the first time in years, I started thinking less about what my family needed from me and more about what I was still allowing to happen to myself. 3 days before Christmas Eve, I finally called my attorney back and told him to freeze every automatic payment connected to Daniel's household after the end of the month. Then I hung up the phone, sat quietly in my recliner, and waited for whatever came next. The strange thing about finally stopping is that at first, nobody notices. The world does not suddenly shake because one old man decides he is tired. The snow still falls. Bills still arrive in the mailbox. Coffee still tastes the same at 6 in the morning. But slowly, quietly, life starts rearranging itself around the absence of what you used to give away for free. The week after I froze the automatic payments, I cleaned out my garage for the first time in almost 10 years. Linda always used to joke that I treated old tools like family heirlooms. She was not entirely wrong. I spent 2 full afternoons sorting through rusted wrenches, extension cords, and old HVAC manuals while classic rock played softly from a dusty radio near the workbench. Somewhere in the middle of it, I realized how long it had been since I had done something that belonged only to me. Not for Daniel, not for Emma, not to fix another emergency. Just me. Around that same time, Frank called again from Arizona. "You still know commercial systems better than half the idiots working in Connecticut," he laughed over the phone. "You ever think about consulting part-time?" I almost dismissed the idea immediately. Then I stopped myself. "Maybe," I answered carefully. 2 weeks later, I was driving to small commercial properties across Hartford County, doing inspection consultations 3 days a week. Nothing exhausting. Mostly reviewing aging heating systems for insurance evaluations and renovation projects. The first check I received was only $1,200, but I remember staring at it on my kitchen counter feeling something I had not felt in years. Useful. Not needed. Useful. There is a difference. One afternoon after inspecting a medical office building in New Britain, the property manager, a woman named Denise, probably in her early 60s, handed me a cup of terrible vending machine coffee and said, "You know, most people your age are trying to disappear quietly." I laughed a little. I tried retirement once. Turns out I am bad at sitting still. "Good," she said. "The world already has enough invisible old men." That sentence stayed with me all week. My routine started changing after that. I joined a small breakfast group at a diner downtown where retired electricians, firefighters, and contractors met every Thursday morning. Nobody cared about appearances there. Nobody asked what your family thought of you. They talked about knee replacements, fishing boats, and whether the Yankees would ever stop embarrassing themselves. One man named Walter looked at me over pancakes one morning and asked, "So what kept you busy all these years?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I honestly did not know how to explain it anymore. Saving people, maybe. Trying to. Around Christmas week, my phone finally started ringing again. Not from Daniel at first. Banks. Service providers. The heating company asking whether I still wanted to remain listed as backup guarantor for the Bennett household account. I removed my name quietly from every document they sent. No speeches. No warnings. Just signatures. Then, on December 23rd, Daniel finally called. I let it ring twice before answering. "Dad." His voice sounded strained. "Hey." There was a long silence. "The mortgage company called today. I figured they would eventually." Another silence. I could hear him breathing unevenly. Melissa thought there had been some kind of banking mistake. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the snow-covered yard. Was there? He did not answer that. Instead, he asked softly, "Are you really done helping us?" That question would have destroyed me 6 months earlier. But now I noticed something different hidden. Underneath it. Not concern for me. Fear. Fear of losing the structure that had quietly held their lives together. "I am not abandoning you, Daniel," I said calmly. "But I am done protecting grown adults from the consequences of their own decisions." He sounded stunned hearing me say that. "Dad." You and Melissa need to figure out what kind of life you can actually afford. He started to say something else, but stopped. Then quietly, almost like a child again, he asked, "What if we lose the house?" I closed my eyes for a second because despite everything, hearing fear in my son's voice still hurt. "Then you start smaller," I answered, like most people do. After we hung up, I sat there in silence expecting guilt to crush me the way it always used to. But it did not. For the first time in years, I felt something steadier than guilt. I felt boundaries. And the very next morning, an unexpected phone call from one of the largest commercial property firms in Hartford hinted that my life was about to become much bigger than anybody in my family realized. The call came from a company called Harlan Property Group out of downtown Hartford. I almost ignored it because I did not recognize the number. A younger version of me would have answered immediately. But somewhere over the last few months, I had stopped feeling obligated to rush toward every demand life threw at me. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Karen Whitmore, Regional Operations Director. "Mr. Bennett, Frank DeLuca gave us your name," she explained. "We manage several older commercial buildings across Connecticut, and frankly, we are tired of consultants who only know systems from spreadsheets." I laughed quietly at that. "So what exactly are you looking for?" "Somebody who actually understands buildings." 2 days later, I drove into Hartford wearing the same navy winter coat I had owned for almost 12 years. The city looked different that morning somehow. Cleaner. Sharper. Maybe I was the thing that had changed. Their office sat on the 14th floor of a glass building overlooking the Connecticut River. Young employees carrying tablets moved quickly through the lobby while Christmas decorations glowed softly near the reception desk. I suddenly became very aware of my age standing there among all those polished people in expensive shoes. Then a maintenance supervisor named Leon walked up, shook my hand firmly, and smiled. "You are Bennett." "That obvious?" "Frank said you are the only guy alive who can diagnose a boiler problem by listening to it cough." That made me laugh harder than it should have. They brought me through 3 separate buildings that afternoon. Office towers, medical clinics, a warehouse renovation project with heating problems nobody had solved properly in months. I spent 4 straight hours climbing utility stairs, checking valves, reading pressure gauges, and explaining system failures to engineers half my age. Something strange happened while I worked. My shoulders stopped feeling heavy. My voice stopped sounding uncertain. People listened when I spoke. Not politely. Seriously. At one point, a younger project manager named Ethan interrupted me while I was explaining airflow issues in a basement mechanical room. "Wait," he said, looking at his notes. "You figured all that out in like 10 minutes? I shrugged. 45 years in the business buys you pattern recognition. Leon laughed loudly. "We have been arguing about this problem for 3 weeks. By the end of the day, Karen handed me a temporary company badge with Consulting Operations Specialist printed beneath my name. It sounds silly now, but I stared at that badge for almost a full minute sitting in my truck afterward. My name, my own role, my own value. Not somebody's father, not somebody's emergency contact. Just Richard Bennett. I started working with them part-time after New Year's. 3 days a week turned into 4 because I genuinely enjoyed it. They gave me a small office with a coffee machine older than some of the interns and a whiteboard filled with handwritten maintenance schedules. One morning, I walked in wearing a gray Harlan maintenance jacket Leon had ordered for me, and one of the younger employees nodded toward it while grinning. "Careful, Richard. You are starting to look official around here." Terrifying thought, I answered. But secretly I liked hearing it, more than I expected. The strange thing was how quickly confidence returns once people stop treating you like a burden. During meetings, people asked for my opinion before making decisions. Building managers called me directly for advice. One afternoon, Karen pulled me aside after a presentation and said, "You know you are the calmest person in this entire company, right?" I almost told her she should meet my family before making that judgment. Instead, I just smiled. Around mid-January, I finally bought myself something unnecessary for the first time in years. A dark green Ford F-150 with heated seats and less than 20,000 miles on it. Nothing flashy. But when I parked it in my driveway that evening, I sat there for a minute with my hands on the steering wheel, realizing I had spent most of my life feeling guilty every time I enjoyed something for myself. That feeling was starting to disappear. Slowly, quietly. Then one Thursday afternoon, while reviewing maintenance contracts in my office, my cell phone buzzed across the desk. Daniel's name appeared on the screen for the first time in almost 3 weeks. I stared at it while snow drifted past the window outside. Then I answered calmly and heard panic in my son's voice before he even finished saying hello. And suddenly, after everything that had changed inside me, the story began circling back toward that Christmas dinner all over again. "Dad, I need to see you." Daniel sounded completely different on the phone that afternoon. Not defensive, not careful, just exhausted. I leaned back in my office chair while staring at snow collecting along the Hartford sidewalks below my window. "What happened?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Can we do this in person?" We agreed to meet that evening at a small coffee shop halfway between Fairview and his neighborhood. I arrived early after work, still wearing my Harlan jacket and company badge clipped near my chest. The girl behind the counter smiled at me while pouring coffee. "Long day?" she asked. "Not over yet," I answered quietly. Daniel walked in 20 minutes later looking worse than I had ever seen him. His beard was uneven, like he had stopped paying attention to himself. His winter coat hung open despite the cold outside. He sat down across from me and immediately rubbed both hands over his face. "You look tired," I said carefully. He let out a hollow laugh. "That is one word for it." For a minute, neither of us spoke. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter while Christmas songs played softly through ceiling speakers. Finally, Daniel looked up at me. "The house is 3 months behind now." I stayed quiet. "Melissa thought she could refinance after the holidays," he continued. "But the bank denied it this morning." He stared down into his untouched coffee. "Credit cards are maxed out too." I watched him carefully while he spoke. Months ago, I would have jumped straight into fixing things. Writing checks, calling lawyers, offering solutions nobody asked me for. But now I simply listened. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "Dad," he said slowly, "why are you so calm?" I honestly thought about the answer before speaking. Because panic never solved anything for our family. He swallowed hard after that. Then quietly, he admitted something I think he had been carrying for years. "I do not even know how bad things actually are anymore." There was so much shame in his voice that for a second I saw the little boy who used to cry whenever he disappointed anybody. "Does Melissa know?" I asked. Daniel laughed bitterly. "She knows enough to blame me." Then his expression changed suddenly. "She still thinks you are eventually going to help us." That sentence landed differently now. Not because it hurt, because it no longer controlled me. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "That sounds like a dangerous assumption." Daniel stared at me for several seconds. "You really mean that?" "Yes." He looked genuinely shaken, realizing I was serious. Outside the windows, snow kept drifting under the streetlights while cars moved slowly through slush-covered roads. Daniel finally lowered his voice. "Christmas Eve is going to be rough." "Why?" He hesitated. "Melissa invited a bunch of people." "Of course she did. Her sister, Carol, some neighbors, people from Emma's school." I almost smiled at the predictability of it. "Appearances. Always appearances." And Daniel looked miserable. "She still thinks everything can be held together if we just survive the holidays." He rubbed his eyes tiredly. "She does not understand what tomorrow looks like." Tomorrow. The $9,000 payment due to contractors, utilities, and overdue accounts. The same payment I had quietly covered every month for nearly a year without most of the family even knowing it existed. I sat there listening to the soft hum of conversations around us, while something calm settled deeper inside me. For the first time in years, I was no longer reacting emotionally to my family's chaos. I was observing it clearly. Daniel looked at me nervously. "Are you still coming Christmas Eve?" I thought about saying no. Honestly, part of me wanted to. But another part needed to see how far the illusion had gone. "Yes," I answered finally. "I will be there." He looked relieved for reasons I do not think he fully understood himself. As we stood to leave, he glanced down at the Harlan badge clipped to my jacket. "You seem different lately," he admitted quietly. I buttoned my coat slowly before answering. Maybe I finally remembered I existed before everybody started needing things from me. He did not know what to say to that. Neither did I. And as I drove home through the falling snow that night, I could already feel something waiting for us at that Christmas dinner table. Something fragile. Something that had been held together by my silence for far too long. And by the next evening, everybody in that house was about to learn exactly what happened when that silence finally ended. Christmas Eve arrived under a gray Connecticut sky, with freezing rain tapping against the windshield while I drove toward Daniel's neighborhood. The streets were lined with glowing decorations and inflatable snowmen, but the closer I got to their house, the heavier everything felt. I parked across from the driveway for a moment before getting out. Through the front windows, I could already see people moving around inside, holding wine glasses and paper plates while Christmas music drifted faintly through the walls. Melissa had turned the entire evening into a performance. Again, the second I stepped inside, warm air and the smell of cinnamon hit me at once. "Grandpa," Emma ran toward me before anyone else could react and wrapped her arms around my waist so tightly I nearly lost my balance. "Hey, sweetheart." I handed her a small silver gift bag and she smiled immediately. "Mom said not to expect presents this year because everybody needed to be responsible," she whispered quietly. I glanced up and saw Melissa across the room, laughing with her sister while pretending not to notice us. Daniel looked exhausted already. There were maybe 12 people in the house altogether. Neighbors. Carol. A couple from Emma's school. Somebody from Melissa's yoga studio. I recognized almost none of them. But I noticed something else immediately too. My usual chair at the dining table was gone. In its place sat a decorative wooden reindeer centerpiece with candles around it. Melissa walked over smoothly holding a glass of white wine. "Richard," she said brightly, "we are doing more casual seating this year." Clearly, she smiled like she did not hear the edge in my voice. "You can sit near the den." A folding chair sat half outside the dining room entrance near the hallway. Not technically away from everyone, just separate enough to send a message. Carol avoided looking directly at me. Daniel looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him alive. But strangely enough, I did not feel embarrassed anymore. Just awake. During dinner, people talked loudly about ski trips, housing prices, and private schools while Melissa floated around refilling drinks like some kind of hostess in a commercial. Every few minutes, she dropped comments designed to sound innocent. Financial stress really changes people. Boundaries are healthy during difficult seasons. Some family members struggle when they are no longer needed the same way. Nobody challenged her because most of them did not understand who she was actually talking about. Then sometime after dessert, while people were gathering near the fireplace, Melissa walked behind my chair and leaned down close enough for only me to hear her. Her voice stayed perfectly calm. "You really should stop trying to make Daniel feel guilty for becoming independent." I looked up slowly. "Independent? You know exactly what I mean." She smiled faintly while adjusting one of the candles on the table. "Money does not buy permanent access to people." For a second, I just watched her quietly. Then I reached for my wine glass and took a slow sip. Around us, everybody kept talking and laughing, completely unaware of what was happening. Finally, I answered in the same calm tone she had used. "Then I hope you can cover the $9,000 due tomorrow." Her expression changed instantly. Not dramatic. Just one tiny flicker of confusion breaking through her confidence. "Excuse me?" she asked softly. Daniel looked over immediately from across the room because he heard me. I set the wine glass down carefully. "Mortgage arrears, utility balances, contractor payments, insurance deadlines." Melissa stared at me without blinking now. "Richard, this is not the time for whatever this is." "Actually," I said quietly, "it is exactly the time." The room had started growing quieter around us because people could feel something shifting even if they did not know what yet. Daniel stepped forward slowly. "Dad?" I looked directly at Melissa. "You spent the last 6 months telling people I used money to control this family." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. "Tomorrow morning," I continued calmly, "you are about to find out what this household actually costs without me." The silence after that felt enormous. Carol looked pale. Daniel looked like he might collapse from exhaustion right there beside the fireplace. But Melissa still tried to hold on to control. "You are trying to embarrass us in front of guests," she said tightly. I shook my head once. "No, I think reality is about to do that on its own." Then from somewhere near the hallway, Emma's small voice quietly broke the silence. "Wait, Grandpa was paying for all this." And suddenly every person in that house turned to look at Melissa. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Emma asked that question. The only sound in the room was the soft crackling from the fireplace and Bing Crosby singing somewhere faintly from a Bluetooth speaker in the kitchen. Melissa looked stunned that the conversation had slipped out of her control so quickly. Daniel finally stepped forward and rubbed both hands over his face like he had been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. "Dad has been covering the shortages," he admitted quietly. One of the neighbors frowned in confusion. "Shortages?" Daniel swallowed hard before answering. Mortgage payments, utility balances, insurance, school tuition. Carol stared at him. Daniel, what are you talking about? He looked over at her with tired eyes. What do you think I've been talking about with him every month? The room changed after that. You could feel it happen. People stopped seeing me as the bitter old man Melissa had described and started looking around the house differently. The expensive decorations, the catered desserts, the polished image. Suddenly it all looked fragile instead of impressive. Melissa crossed her arms tightly. This is incredibly inappropriate to discuss in front of guests. You brought guests into a private situation, I answered calmly. Not me. She opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel interrupted her for the first time all evening. No, Melissa. Stop. That silence afterward hit harder than shouting ever could have. Even Emma looked surprised hearing her father use that tone. Daniel turned toward everyone slowly. My father has been helping us for years, he admitted. Not because he wanted control. Because we were drowning. Melissa shook her head immediately. You are making it sound worse than it is. Daniel laughed once in disbelief. Worse. He pointed toward the dining room table. The heating bill last month was almost shut off. Her face flushed instantly. Do not do this right now. Then when? He asked quietly. After the bank takes the house? Nobody moved. One of the guests awkwardly set down a wine glass and muttered something about checking on the kids downstairs before disappearing from the room entirely. Carol looked pale, standing near the fireplace. Richard, she said softly, why did you not tell anybody? I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because I thought protecting my family mattered more than protecting my image. That one landed hard. Melissa looked furious now, but underneath the anger I could finally see fear breaking through. Real fear, not social embarrassment. Consequences. You cannot just cut us off without warning, she said sharply. I reached into my coat pocket calmly and pulled out a folded packet of papers. I did warn you. Daniel stared at the documents immediately because he recognized them. Mortgage notices, overdue contractor invoices, payment schedules, copies of emails I had forwarded to him over the past 6 months with subject lines marked urgent. I handed them to him quietly. Every one of those came before tonight. Melissa looked at Daniel in shock. You told me everything was under control. Daniel's expression collapsed completely. Because every time I tried telling you the truth, you started talking about appearances. The room went dead silent again. Emma stood near the hallway, clutching the silver gift bag I had given her earlier, like she suddenly felt unsafe inside her own home. I noticed that more than anything else. A child realizing adults had been lying around her for a very long time. Melissa looked toward me again, but her voice sounded different now, less confident. So what happens next? I answered honestly. That depends on whether you finally start living inside reality. Nobody had a response to that. After a while, guests slowly began leaving one by one with awkward hugs and mumbled excuses about early mornings. Carol tried speaking to me near the front door while putting on her coat. Richard, I did not understand how serious things were. I nodded once. That seems to be a pattern lately. She looked ashamed after that. By the time the house emptied out, only the 4 of us remained standing near the dying Christmas tree lights. Daniel sat at the kitchen table staring blankly at the overdue notices while Melissa leaned silently against the counter, looking smaller somehow. Not humbled completely, but shaken. Finally, I picked up my coat. Emma immediately looked up. Grandpa, are you leaving? I looked at her sweet little face and felt my chest tighten. For tonight, sweetheart. Then I turned toward Daniel and Melissa one last time. I am willing to have a relationship with this family, I said calmly. But I will never again finance a lie. Neither of them stopped me when I walked toward the front door. But just before I stepped outside into the freezing night air, Daniel quietly said something behind me that made me pause with my hand still on the doorknob. Dad, there is something else you still do not know. I stood there by the front door with my hand still resting on the knob, while snow blew softly across the porch outside. Daniel looked exhausted standing in the middle of the living room beneath the fading Christmas lights. What else? I asked quietly. He swallowed hard before answering. Melissa never knew the college account already existed before we got married. I frowned slightly. What are you talking about? Daniel looked down at the stack of overdue papers in his hands. The account for Emma. The one we took money from. His voice cracked a little after that. Mom started it. For a second I could not speak at all. Linda. Of course she did. My wife had quietly opened that account when Emma was born and added money to it every birthday and every Christmas before she died. Daniel sat down heavily at the kitchen table while rubbing both hands over his face again. Mom made me promise I would never touch it unless it was an emergency. Melissa looked genuinely stunned hearing that for the first time. You told me it was savings from your father. Daniel finally looked at her directly. Because you always treated him like a bank instead of a person. The room went completely silent after that. I stared at the Christmas tree lights reflecting softly across the windows and suddenly understood why this hurt so deeply. It was never just about money. It was about memory. About love being reduced to transactions by people too lost to recognize sacrifice anymore. Melissa sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. I did not know, she whispered. I believed her. But strangely enough, that did not fix anything. Because not knowing had become its own kind of choice over the years. The next few months were uncomfortable for everyone. Daniel and Melissa sold the house by spring after realizing they could not maintain the payments anymore. They moved into a smaller townhouse outside Newington with one bathroom, older appliances, and none of the polished perfection Melissa spent years chasing. And honestly, something surprising happened after that. They started acting like a real family again. Daniel looked lighter. Emma laughed more. Even Melissa slowly changed once there was no image left to protect. Not overnight. Real change never happens overnight. But little things started shifting. She got a full-time accounting job. Started cooking at home instead of pretending every holiday needed to look like a magazine cover. One afternoon months later, she came to my house alone carrying a cardboard bakery box with homemade blueberry muffins inside. She stood awkwardly on the porch for several seconds before speaking. I do not expect forgiveness immediately, she said quietly. I just wanted to stop pretending I was not wrong. I studied her face carefully. For once there was no performance there. Just exhaustion. Honesty. Maybe even shame. Come inside, I answered. Healing is a strange thing. It rarely arrives as one dramatic moment. Usually it looks like quieter conversations. Smaller rooms. Fewer lies. These days my life is simpler than it used to be, but somehow fuller too. I still work part-time with Harlan because I genuinely enjoy it. Emma visits every Sunday afternoon now, and together we rebuilt the old bird feeder Linda used to keep outside the kitchen window. Daniel calls me again most mornings while driving to work. Not because he needs money, just because he wants to hear my voice. And honestly, that means more to me than anything I ever paid for. A few weeks ago, Emma noticed the old folding chair still sitting in my garage from that Christmas Eve. Why do you keep that ugly thing? She laughed. I looked at it for a second before answering. Because sometimes people need reminders of what they survived. She thought about that quietly while snow drifted outside the garage door. Then she smiled and handed me a screwdriver. Well, she said, maybe we can fix it instead of throwing it away. I do not think she realized how much wisdom was hidden inside that sentence. If there is one thing this whole experience taught me, it is that love without boundaries eventually turns into resentment. Helping people is beautiful. Sacrificing yourself until you disappear is not. You can love your family deeply and still refuse to finance dysfunction. You can forgive someone without reopening every door they once walked through carelessly. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people is let them finally face the weight of their own choices. If you are listening to this tonight while feeling invisible inside your own family, please hear me when I say this. Your value does not decrease because someone failed to recognize it. Do not let guilt convince you that suffering quietly is the same thing as love. Protect your peace. Protect your finances. Protect your spirit. God, life, the universe, whatever you believe in, did not put you here simply to become useful until there is nothing left of you. My name is Richard Bennett. I am 72 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is this. The people who truly love you will never require you to erase yourself to earn a seat at the table. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Truly, stories like this remind us we are less alone than we think we are. And if this journey meant something to you, maybe leave a comment sharing where you are listening from and what part stayed in your heart the longest. You can subscribe if you would like to hear more stories about family, healing, betrayal, resilience, and the quiet ways people rebuild themselves after life breaks apart. Because somewhere in the next story, there may be another father, another mother, another son, or another lonely person sitting in the dark wondering if anybody else understands what they are carrying. And maybe together, one story at a time, we remind each other that surviving is not the same thing as losing.